So this is very important to remember that we have a lot of leftists, but no real left movement. And how did we get to this? We'll talk a lot about this when we get to groups infusion and the practico-inert. How did we get to this position of the practico-inert? And it doesn't seem like there's any way out in some ways, or no thinking way out, even though we're still in these moments of high protest, some resistance, etc. But how can we forge a future together? And we've done a lot of work over the last years, and I thank certainly the people that have been here, on the work of Bernard Stiegler, who also was a French Alsatian, like Sartre, who was Alsatian, and work on Heidegger, work on Alain Badiou a little bit. So trying to fit these things together too, try to think through think through the moment and get some motion going again, get it going again, the movement. So for me, the interest here, and I'll sort of begin too to maybe ask you if you have any background, but I'm going to try to situate Sartre. Of course, most people know Sartre through Being and Nothingness and the plays and the novella Nausea, right? Nausea made his career, if you will. I think 1938 was the date of publication. This basically gave him a stipend that was lifelong from Gallimard. He became, quote, known as the privileged stipendiary, and he was able to quit teaching. He hated teaching, supposedly, this is very important to remember that he started out as a novelist and a philosopher. He flunked his exams the first time around at the Sorbonne. The second time he aced them, of course. He was in the class with Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Levi-Strauss, Simone de Beauvoir. They're all part of the same generation. And this opens up, Beryl will know this name, Mannheim's great essay, The Problem of Generations, right? That once upon a time, there's a generation that just was something. And to my mind, this was the great generation, Germany before that, etc. So, of course, the Lukács generation, the generation, you had the Freud, moment, of course, Marx before that. But this was a generation that came up during the proverbial Great Depression and, materialized actively after the Second World War, and pretty amazing what they did, pretty amazing. The leading structural anthropologist, the father of existentialism, who really held the rank. Levi-Strauss used to say, even though they argued, this is civilization, this is Jean-Paul Sartre. He would draw diagrams in the class, in a sense, about this. So that was his response to the debates on structuralism versus existentialism. So anyway, all to say, very, very important. And I want to say that, as a philosopher, probably his best work technically, if you want to look at philosophy in very different perspectives, if you will, the most important work really took place in the 1930s. His studies in the ego, the egological realm, the transcendence of the ego, where he studies apperception. He studies, what does it mean to be a we? What does it mean to be an I, right, in a sense, in the world, and doing so phenomenologically through many acts of reduction, etc. So very much under the influence of Husserl at that time in the 1930s. A book on the imagination and also the psychology of imagination, and a book on the emotions. So this was someone that really came up as a very good technical philosopher. Being in Nothingness, as most of you know, was written. He was a prisoner at a Stalag for a little while. He was out after that. He wrote Being in Nothingness during the Vichy, during the occupation, and this made his reputation. The famous story, and maybe this is something that we can talk about as we go on, is that George Bataille, who knew him, etc., met Sartre at a party one night, and he said, You're being and I'm nothingness, let's dance. So this was a kind of funny moment here because Sartre, in a way built a lot of the philosophy and the critique on the notion of scarcity, whereas Bataille brought his on abundance. So it's kind of interesting that Bataille takes the role of nothingness as abundant, and then being is lack, or ultimately negativity and scarcity. So we can speak to that too, because this is something that goes on actively in French philosophy, post World War II in particular. So so in the 30s this happens. Nausea is written, the plays, the flies. Of course, the Condemned of Altona. He goes back and codes things in ancient theater because the Nazis are so stupid they can't pick up on exactly what's going on when he has characters such as Orestes announcing "I am my freedom," or in the flies, certain characters that become commitment. Dirty Hands, which is a story of betrayal in movement politics in some ways, and we'll see maybe some of Dirty Hands play out in the sections in the dialectical reason, a critique of dialectical reason in the pledge, the section on the pledge in groups, which is I think a very important part of this. Also, I put on the board what I think helps found the conversion, if you will. So maybe we can do something about Sartre's radical conversion, after the war, from being the existentialist philosopher, only the thinker of subjectivity. So in 1945, of course, he founds the great journal Temps Moderne, which just closed recently. It had a very long run, over 75 years. His adopted daughter, and I don't know if I try to punctuate a little bit by anecdotes because these people are very fascinating. Arlette El Haim is his adopted daughter. He adopted her. He got a letter from her. She was doing her exams in philosophy in Algeria, and it was on Sartre. And the committee was giving her a lot of problems. So she asked Sartre, could you come and help me, through this, or help me in this? So of course, Sartre, being who he was, goes there and he tells the committee, you know nothing of my work. She's on point, right? So enough of it. He adopts Arlette later, right, as a daughter. And of course, there's a battle set up, as Sartre, only Sartre would do, Simone de Beauvoir and the adopted daughter who studies philosophy. And again, this is a story under the proper name Jean-Paul Sartre that is just filled with anecdotes that are very important. The other thing, the meeting with Charlie Parker, the great saxophonist. They met at a club in Paris, and Sartre went up to the stage afterwards. I really enjoyed your playing, Mr. Parker. And Charlie Parker said, I've enjoyed your playing too, Monsieur Sartre. so anyway, and all these little things. And these were people, and I think one of the attractions is these are not academic philosophers, especially Sartre and de Beauvoir. These are people that lived in the world. They were engaged. They basically were cafe people who lived in the world, were in the thick of the latest political movements, almost all the way until his death, really, through the 70s. He died in April of 1980. 500,000 people on the streets in Paris marching, led by Yves Montand, who had turned to the right somewhat. And one of his students, by the way, when he was at the Lycée, was Simone Signoret. Her philosophy teacher was Jean-Paul Sartre, so the great actress, and beau of Yves Montand. So anyway, to go back to this, I see in his work, a kind of conversion, getting out of the moment of the Temps Moderne, where he begins to, if you will, they want to use the organ, like we try to do with situations in a sense, in a much lesser way, but where he Merleau-Ponty, Simone de Beauvoir, Raymond Aron was one of the other, and the sociologist, were all part of the founding committee, but it was under the direction of Sartre himself mostly. And this journal became a piece for a kind of leftist term in France on a regular basis, right? And it was actually a voice that was outside Humanité, the communist paper, a journal, and he was really struggling, if you will, with being a Marxist, but at the same time, not submitting to party dogma. And this was something that he, I think, began to struggle with actively, especially under the banner of what is materialism, right? What is materialism, historical materialism, and dialectical materialism. So he writes a piece. You can get this online, Materialism and Revolution. And those of you in New York, you may know the name Annette Michelson, who was the head of the NYU film program, very well known. She was the founder of the avant-garde journal October, that came out for many, many years. She translated this piece. She was a Trotskyist in her earlier days. She translated this into English. In the 50s, actually, it was available. But in 48, he writes this in French, and it's out. And then also, I mark the moment, and going back to the psychology, if you remember the journal article, it was an article that he published, yes, on materialism. Yeah. Not a book. Yeah. So 1952 to me marks the first experiment from the end of being and nothingness, existential psychoanalysis. And those of you, that were with us, when we did the anti-Oedipus, well, Sartre, of course, tries to find something beyond Freud, right? The existential psychoanalytic moment, right? Where you would take the best of Freud, infantile sexuality, what our childhoods are about, etc. But at the same time, bring back into it something called freedom, right? And choice, right? Because he saw a real moment of determinism in the French psychoanalytic scene. And this was, an ongoing moment between him and Jacques Lacan for many, many years, etc. So this could be an interesting topic in the critique too, of where Sartre went. So the existential psychoanalysis, the first study was Jean Genet, 1952. This was published. Actor and Martyr was the subtitle. Yeah. And, he goes through Genet's formation, the choices he made. He had a concept, what he called the originary choice, right? The originary choice, or the original choice, but I like originary better because it's more active, right? The originary choice that one makes in terms of developing their project, right? Right? And the famous saying of Sartre was, man is a useless passion because of his desire to become God. So this was another, thing that he did, in terms of the psychology of the moment. But a massively gifted, in my opinion, and Carl certainly can speak to this, I'm sure, a massively gifted psychologist, student of human motivation, human nature, etc. Yeah, Carl, if you want to say something, please. Yeah.
Well, I do remember the writings that Sartre did on Flaubert and those kinds of analyses, and I was very impressed. I mean, I didn't know anything about their lives at all, but the way he integrated psychology with their social environments.
Yes.
And that's what I've drawn from him. I mean, I haven't read that for many, many years, but that was the thing that I was most impressed with, and I could really use to develop a more social approach to psychology.
Right. Very good. So yeah, there were 4 studies that he did. The Flaubert study was his supposedly the masterpiece. He was thinking of this as his masterpiece at the end of his life. 4 volumes. It was called The Idiot of the Family. Was the subtitle of the study of Gustave Flaubert. 800 pages, the first volume, just on Genesis and Constitution in the first 5 years of Flaubert's life. To give you an idea of what we're dealing with here, in a sense, whether if it's too verbose or whatever, but this phenomenological reduction, this reflexivity, all these kind of things that are going on, it's pretty amazing, what he's digging for and looking at. And, you know, another thing about Sartre, he loved detective novels and mysteries. He loved American hard-boiled, you know, fiction too. You know, he wrote on Dos Passos. He wrote on Faulkner. He loved Dos Passos, the newsreel, the USA trilogy. He loved this stuff. Faulkner, he loved the entire creation there. In fact, the French, Maurice Blanchot, Sartre, and Camus, you know, who was probably his last friend, Camus, you know, as friendships go, all wrote on Faulkner, and they were way ahead of the Americans in terms of bringing Faulkner alive, you know, even though the Americans controlled, you know, the Faulkner studies. But the French are pretty amazing on this, and even today. So, you know, and I'm being from New Orleans, you know a little bit about Faulkner. He lived in the French Quarter, you know, early part of his life before he took off. And he wrote 4 short novels there, including Soldier's Pay, and was friends with Sherwood Anderson, who was there. So the French Quarter in New Orleans was quite a scene back in the 1920s, you know, when Faulkner was getting started. So anyway, the French were the ones that really picked up on this. But going back to Sartre, the last you know, the Baudelaire study and the Mallarmé, the 2 other studies, 2 poets, right? In a way. Personally, I don't really like either of those studies, but they're interesting in terms of watching the, you know, the existential psychoanalytical method at work. You know, in a sense, I think he misses a lot in both Flaubert socially, and I think he misses a lot in Mallarmé. And Sartre had this thing, by the way, I forgot to put up something else that's very important for the left. He wrote a piece called What is Literature?
Yeah.
And for him, prose, the novel, belongs to the proletariat. Poetry, get rid of it, it belongs to the aristocracy. Yeah. So yeah, from Proust forward, yes, exactly. Yeah. So he's you know, and this is a text of what is literature. And of course, this is responded to by, you know, in terms of the history of French, you know, antagonisms and oppositions by Robbe-Grillet for a new novel, and then of course by Roland Barthes later on in writing Degree Zero and the whole semiotic and structuralist approaches. So, you know, this is a very interesting moment, but he considered poetry an aristocratic moment, that the novel was the proletariat. And you know, when we get to the text, we're going to see there is a kind of an affection for the proletariat in Sartre. He likes this, you know, in a way. He goes for the, you know, the hard-boiled film noir, you know, characters, the outsiders, you know, etc. So he has this always going on in his thinking. So anyway, to go back, yeah, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Response to this?
Yeah.
So just called you a practitioner of a bourgeois art.
No, he said aristocratic. He didn't say bourgeois. No, he said aristocratic. Forget it. No, not bourgeois.
Well,
Right.
aristocrats hate work.
Yeah.
So,
There you go. That's right. Good, Tony. Good response.
Good.
Yeah. So anyway, so you know, just dividing up his work. So Saint-Genet to me marks this moment of the social psychology, as Carl was saying earlier. You know, Sartre goes into the social dynamics, the milieu under which Genet is working, why he chooses to be a thief, how he identifies himself then as a writer, and it's a reading through the fiction, but also the milieu of the prison. The time Genet is in the war, right, etc. During the wartime, when he becomes a snitch, really. He was a snitch. You know, he snitched to the fascists a lot. So he goes through this very actively. They remain friends, but supposedly Genet couldn't write for 4 to 5 years after this book was published. It was so that ruthless moment, in a sense, he put Genet supposedly in a writer's block. Yeah. So anyway, so then the debate took place in Temps Moderne, which is also crucial for a background to the critique of dialectical reason. Albert Camus wrote The Rebel, right? And The Rebel was an attack on Francois Jansen's Marxism, right? And against the Stalinist moment, big time, right? In which, you know, Camus basically, kind of makes a move away from, if you will, being a leftist, pure leftist, if you will, in a sense. I think he remained so very much on the left, etc. So they had this debate, that broke up the friendship. It was very vicious in terms of the attacks. Francois Janson, if you don't know the name, wrote a very good book on the moral philosophy of Sartre. He was also the head of the Janson network, which was an arms network to the FLN in Algeria. It was known as the Janson network. And if you've seen the movie La Chinoise, Jean-Luc Godard, Francois Janson is the philosopher on the train with Annie Deminisky, riding along, and she's asking about the meaning of life, what do we do politically, et cetera, et cetera. And he says tells her to take it easy while he's running guns to Algeria. But anyway, it's an interesting moment. So this was a very interesting moment where Sartre kind of starts to break his only friendship. They liked hanging out together. They were known as a kind of the existential couple, if you will. Camus and Sartre, they hung out a lot in the left bank together. And remember, this became a kind of almost Vogue magazine, attempt to hear Sartre and see them on the left bank. And this became cafe writers, people that would go to see. So you had André Breton and the Surrealist crowd at the Café Figaro, and you had Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir at Du Magot. And these were the two, the existentialists and the surrealists fighting each other. And of course, Levi-Strauss, aristocrat that he was, would go to the Dome to take his coffee, right? Which was not a great place for overactivity. So anyway, very interesting in this regard, how this began to take place. So then, we're going to start, and I hope you had a chance. Maybe we go over it tonight. I'm under instructions. I have to finish at 8:45, so I'll try my best to do that. But we're going to look at this later. How he makes these turns, these conversions from the being and nothingness phase, which he considered, if you will, bourgeois philosophy. He disavowed it. He disavowed all his earlier work. The only thing he thought that should be read from his bourgeois past, pre-48, if you will, was Le Mot, his autobiographical attempt at words, right, which is worth reading. And then, for those of you who don't know, Charles Schweitzer was his grandfather, the inventor of the Berlitz method, and Albert Schweitzer was his first cousin. So, so Charles Schweitzer, the inventor of Berlitz method of languages. And you begin to see him, he used to say he had no super ego because he had full possession of his mother. This is how he used to engage the Oedipal complex, because his father, he was basically, the only child, and his mother doted on him, etc. And, he makes a good analysis of this early on in his work on Le Mot, doing his own self-psychology and relations. So anyway, obviously he is a fellow traveler of the Communist Party. The French Communist Party, very strong after the war, many members, not as strong as the Greeks, or maybe, but close enough to the Italians. The Greek Communist Party was incredibly strong. Why? They continually tried to, defeat us, right? And why there were actual assassinations. For those of you who don't know, there was an outright targeted shootings of at least 40 people in the crowd at Constitution Square, which is known as Syntagma Square, ordered by Churchill. Yeah, and so to be really, this is known. It's a et cetera. So someone was asking, can we zoom in on the whiteboard? I don't know. There's not that much up, but yeah. So anyway, so to go back, if you will, he's this fellow traveler in a pretty strong, French Communist Party, but never joins, never really engages the Communist Party on their own terms, always as a kind of outsider fellow traveler. And, again, the idea here was who was in possession of Hegelian Marxism best, right? This was the philosophical stake, if you will. Who was the best of the Hegelians, right? Okay. Is that Oh, I see. Okay, no problem. So the idea here again is to read this partially as an attempt, and I'm reminded of another story. The last time I was at the People's Forum was actually with Cornell West and Stanley Aronowitz. We did a class on history and class consciousness of Lukács. And if you had a chance to read this, one of the founding father of Marxism and philosophy, or Marxist philosophy, is history and class consciousness. No question in my mind, in a sense. Lukács was the man, right, who started, if you will, for lack of a better term, I put this term in a lot of quotation marks, the father of Western Marxism, what is called Western Marxism, even though he's Eurasian, he's coming from from Hungary. So anyway, you'll see this attempt to engage Lukács on the level of subjectivity. What is subjectivity? What is the subject? How do we engage this going forward? So this would be a very important moment for us to begin with, because Sartre's attempt here, and if you read this, he said existentialism, his own philosophy, is a parasitical system living off of Marxism. This is a quote of his. It's a parasitical system, but he goes on, we still need it, right? Yeah. It is a parasitic, this is on page 8 of the book. It is a parasitical system living on the margin of knowledge, which at first opposed, but which today it seeks to be integrated, right? If we are to understand the present ambitions and its function, we must go back to the time of Kierkegaard. So this opens up, a kind of a new attempt of the Hegelian system, or to understand the Hegelian system in a Marxist light, right? And Sartre is going to go back through, first of all, through Kierkegaardian subjectivity, right? And then to try to take it further into, what ultimately, why we have to keep, everyday existence active in terms of the tradition. And he finds that the dialectical materialism became very mechanical, dogmatic, and automatic, Marxism. Too economistic, too much, involved in having, quote, the truth. We have the truth in our possession, but not really ultimately the truth, if you will, of subjectivity. So this is kind of crucial to try to understand as we read this, because again, the attempt here is to bridge, first of all, right? To bring back the subject or subjectivity better into Marxism, right? Which it did not have anymore. And also to make the case about the proletariat, once again, in a very different light, right? As most of you know, for Lukács, the proletariat is the agent of history, right? Is, ultimately the subject of history, right? For Lukács. Sartre agrees with this, but he is trying to take it in a much deeper way where everyday existence is put out there in a way, choice, and then ultimately bringing back the question of freedom in some way. So I don't know, maybe we could, talk about, how he's going to go about this, some of the crucial terms in the first chapter. It's the relationship, again, of Marxism, French Marxism during that time, which was headed up by Roger Garadet and others et cetera. I'll tell you another little story. I'm sorry to do this, but I think it elucidates, like Sartre used plays. I'll try to use some anecdotes to try to elucidate this better. Etienne Balibar, told me the story many years ago that he got kicked out of the French Communist Party. He stayed very late, well after, the debacle in '78. And he wrote a piece called "Open Your Windows, Comrades." And that's why I got kicked out, for criticizing that, for not being too dogmatic, the party. You're not really open to the new situations. So in a sense, so Sartre is really in that same kind of moment. He's actually saying, look, I see the moment here. I want to be with you as a fellow traveler, but you're missing crucial parts and points as we go ahead. So when we get to the critique for the first section, which is really on the dialectical method, the dogmatic versus the critical dialectic, we'll start to see this at work, how he's building his argument through the methodological. But the first step here is the relation, the problem of how do you bring subjective activity back into the objective conditions under which we all live. What is the role of subjectivity in history capitalized? So I think this is very important, again, to keep in mind as you read this. And he is giving his hat off to Marx and the Marxists, in a sense, saying that this existentialism is a parasitical system, but it's still a system that is living within this, right, in a sense. So we have somewhat of a contradiction going on, but at the same time, something that, he is really trying to examine, in many ways.
It was just think,
So,
Michael,
sure.
on page
Yeah.
21.
Yeah.
He actually talks about this.
Yeah.
And Lukács, and about halfway down, because we were convinced. I like how he says we. I think he's really saying I. We and our. But anyway, we were convinced that one and the same time that historical materialism furnished the only valid interpretation of history, and that existentialism remained the only concrete approach to reality. And I don't know, it sounds like that's kind of the approach he has retained in some way, or is it, do you think he's talking about an earlier stage?
Well, I think I'm on page, I'm a little bit ahead of you. I'm sorry, I'm having a problem with that's in line. I should bring a pair of reading glasses, but anyway, I usually don't have this problem. But anyway, let's go to page 21. It's a very good thing, and you read a little bit further down, right? Is it? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to this top, right? Why then has existentialism preserved its autonomy? Why has it not simply been dissolved in Marxism? This seems to me to be the crux, the question. And thank you, Carl. This is basically the crux, if you will, of this chapter. Lukács believed that he had answered the question in a small book called Existentialism and Marxism. According to him, bourgeois intellectuals have been forced to, and he quotes, Lukács, to abandon the method of idealism while safeguarding its results and its foundations, hence this historical necessity of the third path. The third path, of course, being realism between materialism and idealism. The struggle has always been in philosophy between idealism and materialism. And one of the great attempts to point this out is Althusser's lectures, if you're interested in this, Philosophy for Non-Philosophers, 1979 lectures he gave to students in Paris. Very wonderful chapter on what is materialism, what is idealism, and the constant struggle, and how we never cross from one to the other. It's not any kind of simple dichotomy. And the problem among the movement, in my estimation, both in Europe and in the States especially, has always been that, materialism has been a dogmatic materialism, that shuns idealism, always is looking for idealism, instead of using Lenin's maxim that intelligent idealism can, really yield some results. Right. And this is interesting. We should keep this in mind. So the third path is a kind of realism, right? The third way it used to be called, for those of you who've been around in left circles for a long time. In actuality, and in the bourgeois consciousness during the imperialistic period, this is Lukács, right? And Lukács wrote this way, and I like this writing, the imperialist period, even though we're much worse than the imperialist period today, So anyway, I shall show later the havoc which this wish to conceptualize a priori has wrought at the center of Marxism. Yeah, this idealism, materialism debate, the either or. Here let us observe simply that Lukács falls absolutely to account for the principal fact we are convinced at one and the same time that historical materialism furnished the only valid interpretations of history, right? Yeah. And that existentialism remained the only concrete approach to reality. I do not pretend to deny the contradictions in this attitude. Many intellectuals, right? I simply assert that Lukács does not even suspect this. Many intellectuals, many students have lived and still live with the tension of the double demand, right? Historical materialism and existentialism. Very, very, very crucial to keep this in mind. And of course, as most of you know, Henri Lefebvre, wrote Everyday Life in the modern world. He begins writing this 1947 is the first volume of Everyday Life in the Modern World. Lefebvre remained a member of the Communist Party until 58. He was their major figure still, as an intellectual. He stayed until 58, 59. Althusser stayed till his death. Right. I mean, he just couldn't give up the party, right? In a sense, right? So, yeah. And unfortunately, he didn't go to Lacan for therapy either. So, well, he may have been more of a monster. Who knows? Yeah, anyway. Okay. So many intellectuals, many students have lived and still live with the tension of the double demand. So you can think of this as always a tension that's going on in terms of historical materialism on the one hand, as a theory of history, as a theory of objective history, as a Hegelian moment of absolute knowledge coming versus that of our everyday existence, the choices we make, the demands everyday life puts upon us, etc. And how is this going to be synthesized? What ground are we going to have to find to do this? And this is one of the tasks, if you will, of the critique of dialectical materialism, how to provide that synthetic ground going forward, right? So, and in some ways, you could read, and we can talk about this later. I'm of the opinion that great works like this and all this moment that is happening with, if you will, with the Sartrean enterprise, etc. You could think of this as a splendid failure, a magnificent failure, right? In the strong sense of magnificence. An edifice that's really been built that we can learn from, but at the same time, really not successful at the end. It becomes the, if you will, the possibility of impossibility only at the end of this. But I'm throwing out some, propositions.
You mean
that
the whole
project, the critique itself. Yeah. It's magnificent in its failure. There's so much in it, right? In a sense, right? Yeah. But okay, so we can go on. This is very interesting. How does this come about? Is it due to a circumstance that Lukács knew perfectly well, but he would not at all at that time mention? Marxism, after drawing this to as the moon draws the tides, after transforming all of our ideas, after liquidating the categories of our bourgeois thought, and this is important too, because we're the Institute for the Radical Imagination. We try to liquidate categories. We try to analyze, annihilate categories that have been coming through the tradition. This is what the organic intellectual does. I mean, this is what it's about, to create new categories. Abruptly left us stranded. It did not satisfy our need to understand. So this is interesting. You're cast adrift, shipwrecked once again by these moments, right? And in the particular situation in which we were placed, it no longer had anything new to teach us because it came to a stop. Okay, so this is where we're situating this. Remember, this is the questions of method, how to make a method to go forward, and we'll talk about, that, I'll put up the terms here and we'll go over this next week. I'll elaborate it more. The progressive regressive method, right? That you're always thinking progressively, but the regress is always happening simultaneously. We're going to begin to see this on a vertical and a horizontal axis, simultaneously. And he takes this from Henri Lefebvre, by the way. He borrows this method from Henri Lefebvre with a lot of the tendencies towards Husserlian phenomenology. Those of you who don't know the name,
What method? Oh, here.
Henri Lefebvre. Right. And progressive, and it's in the footnote, by the way. I'll give you the page number because you can read of how you employ it. Right. Progressive, I'm sorry about this. Yeah. Progressive regressive method, right? And this is borrowed in this by Sartre. One of the quests for the methods is to use the phenomenological reduction, where you get back to the things themselves, the intuitive essences of things. Essence in this sense, something how it's becoming, not how we think about essence as a noun, Wesen as a verb, if you will. Essencing really is maybe one way of looking at this. The phenomenologist is looking that intuitive grasp of the things themselves as something's becoming, right, in a way. Something in process, if you will, always already. And at the same time, and let me see what page, I think there's a long footnote on Lefebvre here. Yes, if you look at page, it's in the next chapter, not for tonight's reading, but just to anticipate it. And if I can read this correctly, I'm sorry, these new printing things are bad. I think it's page, can you read this as page 80?
Page 50.
50, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
The numbers are not
Very bad. Okay, page 52, the thing, you see the descriptive level is one way of the method, the descriptive observation, but with a scrutiny guided by experience and having a general theory by yourself. So I can put this up. You're guided by experience on the descriptive level. This is what's called descriptive phenomenology. In Husserlian phenomenology, you describe the object. What is it in its process? What is it in its essentiality, right? Okay. In that process. The second is the analytic regressive. You have to take a step back in order to undo it, to analyze it, to see the object in a certain way. The reality, dated precisely. When did it come about in terms of a concept or something like that? Very, very close to Michel Foucault's notion of the theoretical juridical act, right? That he speaks to in order of things, and especially in the archaeology of knowledge. How does a regime of truth build itself? What is that precise moment in which something happens? So this is part of the analytic in the regressive, and then the historical genetic to rediscover the present, but elucidated, explained, and understood. How did we get here? The old saying, if we don't know how we got here, how do we know where we're going? Right, in many ways, and this is something that the historical genetic does, right? So this is a double movement that is always happening throughout. This is again on page 52 in the next chapter on the problem of mediations, and just again, of course, Hegel is omnipresent in this book, and I'll go through some of the Hegelian influence in France and what Sartre's picking up here with Hegel.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
If this is an enormous digression,
Yeah,
we
okay,
can skip
sorry.
it, but what was the relationship of Sartre and Lefebvre in terms of just how they intersected? I mean, I've never heard of any dialogue.
They never really had a dialogue, no.
Yeah.
No, they knew each other, but it was not.
They were
It
sort
was
of
not,
operating.
yeah. You have to remember, look, again, Sartre was a very privileged person. He didn't have to really work in the academy. You know, he was not an academic. You know, again, these were he and his, Simone de Beauvoir, his partner, his, pact of freedoms that they had among each other. And, of the affairs, Nelson Algren, she had many, many things, her own adopted daughter as well. So this was a very open-ended, relationship that was based on his and her philosophy developed when they were students at the Sorbonne in the 1930s. So for him and they basically were cafe artists. They would go to their apartment, they would write in their apartments, stay up late at night, they went to clubs, they were out there in the world. These are people that traveled to meet Fidel Castro, Che, people that went to Eastern Europe. If you remember Andreas Baader, the Baader-Meinhof gang. Sartre went to visit him in jail. The press asked him, how did you find him? He said he acted in good faith. And everybody, came after Sartre, then, he's advocating for violence, which he did, in a sense. He was not an illusion, part of that illusion. The relationship to Fanon, another very, very great relationship. I mean, Josh knows the Black Orpheus piece. One of the most brilliant pieces, in my opinion, in terms of the decolonized subjectivity that one can employ at that moment. In some ways,
Whereas Lefebvre was kind of a country boy, right?
Well, he was rural. He
Yeah.
knew how to cook, and I heard stories about him. His family actually met him and went for dinner, and he liked to put mustard in the salad, and all this. I heard all about the little techniques. But let's have, I mean, this is he wrote 80 books. I mean, it's
I just thought like
a major sociologist.
it seems like
Yeah.
there may have been some overlap with the critique,
Well,
the critique of everyday life. I just
well,
wondered why
yeah.
Sartre never.
yeah, I don't think there was really ever a direct engagement with Lefebvre's thought head on. Let me just say this: unless you think through Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche from the 19th century, you miss 95% of French academic life. I mean, or French thought, in a sense. There are appropriations of Hegel. They're trying to escape Hegel, like Foucault. I don't know, at the end of the discourse on language, when he accepted the chair at the Sorbonne, he mentions, I see Hegel waiting for us in the shadows, right? Ready to get us back into the system. And so it speaks to this. I hope you picked up on this kind of circularity where absolute knowing has you, in a way. Kierkegaard's thing, Hegel figured out everything except man. the entire system, but there was no room for man. So listen, I want to propose something, that we can go to. And again, this is just introductory, and I know, just trying to, attune us to this work and this language. I think part of the moment here is to ground, Sartre's intention is to ground the philosophical anthropology that's lacking. He says there's no philosophy. They're only ideologies. He's really trying to ground a Marxist philosophical anthropology. What Marx was lacking, there was not a philosophical anthropology. There was never a really. So this is why Lukács is encountered actively in the beginning. Why Engels will be confronted, in the first book. Those of you that have maybe looked at the critique, Engels, the Dialectics of Nature, will be also encountered in this book. So he's really trying to ground, and think of it this way, to make a philosophical anthropology. And that leads me, and most of you know somewhat how my mind works at times, it leads me, Heidegger's response to this little book, Existential, or this pamphlet, Existentialism is a Humanism, in the letter on humanism, where he said, Heidegger says, Marx is the last great humanist. Right? In a sense, he says this, the letter on humanism. Very interesting that, Marx is the last to think through the humanist project, or to think through. So Sartre, in a way, is taking up something, that he hears later from Heidegger. It's interesting, despite, all darkness surrounding Heidegger's, the situations of his, his moment, taking up, this philosophical anthropology, which Heidegger and Husserl tried to avoid at all costs, the anthropomorphocentrism and anthropology. They did not want philosophical anthropology in the philosophical vocabulary anymore. So you have to think about this. There are oppositions going on. It's not so syncretic, in a way. It's not a syncretic activity, or in a way a synthetic activity either. There are a lot of oppositions going on here, and a lot of borrowing of terminology, but at the same time doing something radically different. So Sartre is very serious about grounding Marx philosophically, and if you pick up on this, it's Kant, it's Marx. Critique comes from Kant when he says critique in the title. Definitely. Dialectical is also Kant and Hegel, right? And of course, Marx. And the two moments. What are the dialectics? The two moments, right? Historical materialism and dialectical materialism. And people are still, they're like what Nietzsche used to say about Kant, everybody's running around in the bushes looking for the categorical imperative. And all Marxists are looking around everywhere. What is dialectics? In a sense. Yeah, still asking, right? And we get all these reductive things going on. So it could be interesting, because he's going to open this up, and I think we can learn a lot about that. What is actual dialectics? What is a Hegelian dialectic versus a Kantian dialectic? How does this happen? How do we eliminate such categories such as transcendental? Transcendence in this sense, right? In a way. Are we really trying to ground an immanent, if you will, philosophical anthropology here? I think this is very, very, again, very crucial to remember. And George E. Lukács, for those of you that have not read History and Class Consciousness, if you read 2 chapters of that book, would be what is Orthodox Marxism, the first chapter, which refers to method, by the way. Right? Orthodox Marxism refers to method. That's the first chapter of the book published, translated by Rodney Livingstone, 1971. And the first chapter of History and Class Consciousness. And then, of course, reification and class consciousness of the proletariat. Crucial for development. The distinctions between reification, objectification, estrangement, all these things that are going on. Very, very crucial. And to read this way with Lukács, because there's really a dialectical mind at work, in my opinion. One of the great Marxist Hegelians. There are a lot of Hegelians, but Sartre is coming out of the Marxist Hegelian. Dawn and I know John Clark very well. He's Hegelian too, but he's not a Marxist Hegelian. He's an anarcho-Hegelian. That's okay. In a way, Sartre, if I was to peg him ultimately, he's an anarcho-communist. Sartre himself, an anarcho-communist in a way, because he wants to keep open the idea of the freedom and also keep thinking the state that withers away, or the anti-statism that ultimately happens. But again, keep in mind the back figure here, the background figure is always Hegel in terms of what he's engaging. Yeah, very much so. And when COVID hit, we did a class at James Baldwin on Hegel. We did a class, what do we call it? Reason and Revolution or something? Yeah, something like that on Hegel. And unfortunately, it was cut so hard, and then we did it online for the rest of the year. So we did the phenomenology. We did the whole phenomenology. So again,
is it fair to say that the Hegel of the phenomenology was the main Hegel that influenced the French tradition more than the logic?
Yes, the phenomenology 1807 was much more influential to people such as Jean Wall, who he mentions. I can put these proper names in because this is something I live, sleep, and eat with. Anyway, Jean Wall, who wrote a book on the unhappy consciousness in Hegel, was one of the first. Hegel is not really taught in the French Academy until the late 20s. It's really dominated by Descartes, Leibniz, the rationalists, in a sense. Hegel does not really enter the French Academy until Jean Wall and others in the 1920s. Bergson is not Hegelian. He's still the leading philosopher during this period. So Jean Wall, and then Hippolyte, who was, everybody's teacher, right? Came in with the breeding of the phenomenologists, genesis and structure. So yes, very important to the entire generation. Hippolyte was the teacher of Althusser, was the teacher of Deleuze, was the teacher of all of them. Sartre knew him, of course. They communicated. It's like, and those of you that have been to Paris, if you're on the left bank, you run into your friends, walking down the street or in the cafes. It's for such a large village, as Stanley used to call it. Paris is a big village, right? You run into these people. They're always, seeing each other in a sense, and they know what's going on. And French thought is warfare. It's really warfare. What's going on there? What's going on at the Sorbonne? And 68, started the movement outside to, Saint Denis. They kept pushing the radicals out further and further into the suburbs almost, because they were really threatened by all of this. So yes, going back to Hegel, absolutely essential to French leftist thinking. And of course, the great lectures, of which I haven't mentioned, are the 1933 to 39 lectures by Alexander Kojève. Absolutely crucial to French thought. Everybody was there. Merleau-Ponty, Simone de Beauvoir, Jacques Lacan picked up his entire style from listening to Kojève, who was supposedly, I've never heard tapes, but supposedly from what I've read, the most, one of the great oral didacts of all time. So 6 years of a reading of the phenomenology. 6 years they spent. And when you speak of the logic, there's a group in Paris. Avron Fleischmann is his name. He's had a 25-year-old group that is just reading the logic, putting this out. So this becomes an obsession. Many people, and I know this. They used to be of course, the young Hegelians after Hegel, right? The left Hegelians, the right Hegelians. Vladimir Putin, Dawn, if you go on to read Dugin, you're going to see the right Hegelians and the right Heideggerians at work in this thinking. So you have the right Hegelians, of which Putin is very influenced by, etc. Some of the Italian philosophers, yeah. Very much influenced by right Hegelian. Yeah, the Christianized version of, but it is. No, Hegel, some people, look, if you read him in context, he's a Protestant ultimately, remember, philosophy is a creative endeavor. You don't just say, you mean what these people are saying and you're going to take it up. You're trying to take concepts and rework them and rethink them in the moment, right? There's no such thing as a pure reading. It's always contaminated, right? So anyway, yeah, but going back to this thing with the Hegel, so of course you have the groups, the left-wing Hegelian. Kierkegaard was part of the right-wing Hegelianism, to go back to subjectivity, and Sartre's pointing this out in terms of the Christian leap of faith. And but anyway, I find Kierkegaard, even when I read him today, I'm not Kierkegaardian, but what a brilliant mind, what a brilliant dialectical mind on problems of everyday existence and the creating of pseudonyms to write on. He wrote a book called Either Or, so he could get out of his marriage, to tell Regina Olsen he can't marry her. He wrote the whole book, Either Or, about them. It's like, like Strindberg getting married on the vicissitudes of marriage. After 5 wives, he finally wrote Getting Married. And Nietzsche was afraid of August Strindberg, so it was another story there. So anyway, yeah, the Hegel is very important. Jean Wall, right? Alexander Kojève, very, very prominent in these moments. I want to point this out. In American philosophy, someone was mentioning pragmatism a little earlier. So I don't know if they're still here, but anyway, Ezra's here. Yeah, the American appropriation of Hegel came through Bradley, F.H. Bradley, the English philosopher. F.H. Bradley, who T.S. Eliot read very actively. There's a whole trace there of the Anglicized version of Hegel too. So you have many versions, that happened over the years. So of Hegel, and this happens. It happens. But in the French scene, yes, the question was the legacy and how to use them, etc. So the logic was used by many Marxists, right, including Yenkov in Russia, to read Hegel's logic, and because Lenin said, and they follow the leader, so to speak, said one will not understand capital until you get through all the categories in Hegel's logic. So this was another thing, So a lot of people would privilege the logic. You've got to know the logic if you're going to understand the vicissitudes of capital. And I know you were going to do a class. I don't know if you're still doing it, but I can there's some very good books on Hegel's logic, and including Di Giovanni and others. But Sartre is more interested in the phenomenology. Jean Hippolyte was interested in the mixture of the two. He wrote a book called Logic and Existence, and Sartre mentions him that he does have an existential approach to Hegel, Hippolyte himself. So anyway, so again, I mean, maybe I should hear from you questions or thoughts about this first 30-something pages. What we may see, what we could use. He also mentions, you may not know these names. M. Rubel is Maximilian Rubel, who is material. You going to church? Church bells, man. Yeah. Anyway, anyway, it's great to be in person, by the way. See everybody in this context. So it's a shame all of you aren't here. I mean, really be nice to do so, in a way. Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, material and revolution is mentioned at the end of the chapter on page 34, and he mentions Maximilian Rubel, who was a very big player in Marxist thinking. Also wrote a pretty good book, Rubel on Spinoza. So I find the first chapter to find a place for existence in materialism, if I could put it that way. That you're really trying to bring in what it means to be outstanding in a history of materialism and moving towards a Marxist materialism. What does it mean to exist in that? And Sartre's great saying, existence precedes essence, I think is still a very radical moment. It's anti-Aristotelian, yes. It's in the existentialism as a humanism. This is a wonderful book in terms of an exercise of a dialectical mind. I suggest reading it. It's a fairly easy read, in many ways. He goes through choice. He gives very, very good examples from everyday life, in this, etc. The Kierkegaard is there, but he really begins with anguish and abandonment. How do we deal with these moments? And something that Marx, the person's no longer here, maybe he felt he knew more than us, it's okay, who did psychology, I think it's very important to look at, again, this notion of abandonment and anguish as something very, very much lost today, in cognitive behavioral attempts at psychology. There's new conditioning moments of psychology that are going on, dominant trends. No longer does one talk about being forlorn, estranged, abandoned, right? In anguish about this, in a sense. And this, in a sense, is a denial, in my opinion, of freedom. It's not only the denial of our human finitude or our, confronting our mortality, but it's also a denial of responsibility for who we are, where we're going, etc. Because we can't stand the anguish of being free. It's really, because as he says, if God is dead, as Dostoevsky says through one of his characters, everything is permitted. And Sartre agrees. Everything is permitted. Let's get on with it. Yeah, in a sense. So this is part of the contingency. The contingency is really, quote unquote, the human being, him, person, or they self, or whatever you want to say today. That is the contingency. Always already. And this is something completely missed. We've become totally risk averse. I see it every day in union meetings and et cetera, totally risk averse. No one can take a risk. I mean, professors with, $1.5 million, $2 million in pensions can't take a risk academically or against administrations. It's unbelievable to me. Yeah, yeah, these levels of lack of courage, lack of compass, lack of being able to really be free. And in a sense, Bratsis and I and, Bruno Gulli have been working, peripherally on techniques of servitude. How do we get to this point where we choose this kind of slavery rather than the freedom? And part of it is anguish. We can't tolerate the anguish that there are consequences in our freedom, that it really gives us this real problem that we have to face, about ourselves and in the choices we make and how to live with them. So Sartre to me, is very, very much a free man in this respect. Very much a free man in this respect.
It's interesting,
yeah.
just
So
thinking about what you just
Yeah.
said, to think about it today in the context of climate change, what we could be facing.
Sure.
In terms of, the retreat from our freedom. I just wanted to say, I
Yeah.
didn't get all the way through the chapter because I just got to it late, but.
well, then you can't speak about it.
But I get most of it. Most of it.
I want you to deal with the totality, Carl.
But I love his explication of sort of what had happened to Marxism under the Soviet regime.
Yeah, why don't you go to that section?
Yeah,
Yeah.
page 22.
Okay, I know Chris would like that. What page is
Yeah,
that?
it's like
Yeah, it's
Marxism stopped and then,
Yeah,
page
okay, great.
22, and then he said, for the moment, the USSR encircled and alone undertook its giant efforts in industrialization, Marxism found itself unable to bear the shock of these new struggles. The practical necessities and the mistakes which are always inseparable from them. And then I won't read everything, but a little bit further down, he talks about, again, there's this encirclement, and the ideology was itself subordinated to a double need. Security, that is unity, and the construction of socialism inside the USSR. Now the party leaders, bent on pushing the integration of the group to the limit, feared that the free process of truth, with all the discussions and all the conflicts which it involves, would break the unity of combat. They reserved for themselves the right to define the line and to interpret the event. That was a great phrase.
Yes.
In addition, out of fear that the experience might not provide its own clarities, that it might put into question certain of their guiding ideas, which might contribute to, quote, weakening the ideological struggle, they put the doctrine out of reach. The separation of theory and practice resulted in transforming the latter into an empiricism without principles, the former into pure fixed knowledge. On the other hand, the economic planning imposed by a bureaucracy unwilling to recognize its mistakes became thereby a violence done to reality. And since the future production of the nation was determined in offices, often outside its own territory, this violence had its counterpart. And this violence had at its counterpart an absolute idealism. I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah, he's brilliant.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean, this is just
whether you like him or not, whether
Yeah,
you
this is-
agree or not, this is brilliant. You're seeing the
Yeah.
brilliance at work
Yeah.
of an extremely steel-trap dialectical mind,
right.
right at work here. He's
Yeah.
very good at holding, he's like Ivan Karamazov, gentlemen of the jury. You should realize that this man can hold 2 points of view simultaneously before you interrogate him.
Mhm.
So, he's really excellent at this, holding both thesis
Yeah.
and antithesis together and then working with it in such a way that it unfolds beautifully. Yeah.
Then he continues, men and things had to yield to ideas
Right.
a priori. Experience, when it did not verify the predictions, could only be wrong.
Right.
Budapest subway was real in Rakossi's
Yeah,
Constituted.
he was a bureaucrat, commie
Yeah, this is very
bureaucrat.
funny. If
in Hungary.
Budapest subsoil did not allow him to construct a subway, this was because the subsoil was counter-revolutionary.
Right. Yeah, great
Marx
humor.
as a philosophical interpretation of man and
Right,
history
right.
necessarily had to reflect the preconceptions of a planned economy.
Beautifully.
And then, yeah, he just goes on and then talk about, you know, the Hungary in
56, yeah.
56.
Yeah.
And again, some of this is very funny. It's like he talks about, you know, how there was no news, everyone already had an opinion. And later there was news, a great deal of news, but I have not heard it said that even one Marxist changed his opinion. And then, you know, he goes from there into the sort of Stalin and Trotsky
Right.
debate.
Right.
And I just found reading it as somebody who grew up, you know, I was born in 1960, but kind of grew up, my dad in particular went through kind of the conversion to communist, Maoist, and then into kind of a quasi-Stalinist organization. I just felt like this you know, he captures sectarian thinking.
Yes.
It's just he nailed
Very good.
I've
Yeah.
never heard anyone
Yes.
so succinctly
Yes.
just like nail what had happened and how it did have real historical roots. There
Right.
was an actual situation that the USSR was confronted with.
Right.
That led to that distortion. But I just thought it was,
If I could say, I think one of the great things about Sartre's mind, if you really follow him here in the use of the we, is that he is a master of apperception. He really understands the we of the apperceptive moment. For Sartre, consciousness is not subjective. There is a consciousness of something out here. You know, consciousness exists in the world. It's not just in us. Or this intentionality. So the we is already the apperception that is from the outside. And he's capturing that. It's very interesting how he goes about that. He is very anti, you know, most of the phenomenologists. He's saying there is a consciousness for you and me. There's just not a consciousness of Chris Miller, but there is a consciousness for Chris Miller and Michael Pelias that exists outside. Right, in a certain way, right, in many ways. So it's all things of consciousness raising, right, in a sense. In Sartre's category, it's the we as the apperceptive we, right, already that exists all the time. So he's very good at looking at what you're just describing, these processes of the we subject and groups, and being able to capture their, you know, if you will, their esprit, their spirit and their movement, and then ultimately how they get stuck in this practico-inert and never really change. You know, because Sartre, I mean, the amazing thing about him to me as a figure is that he's always changing. You know, he's protean in nature. He's like the god Proteus, is always changing shape and stuff. You know, he's always in this kind of motion, this machine. I used to read Anti-Oedipus. When I first read it, I said, I'm reading about Sartre here. You know, this machine. Oh yeah, this is the way I used to think. This is an analysis of Jean-Paul Sartre at work.
But they're sort of anti-Hegelian in that book.
Yes, they are,
Yeah,
of course.
So there's the.
Yes, that's the
tension
dynamic.
between- Yeah.
Right, exactly. This tension that's going on. But anyway, all to say, try to think of it that way, that consciousness is outside. It's not something inside, right, in a certain way. And we'll get to this later with serial thinking. You know, another great moment. We can apply, you know, you can orient a lot of the thought here to things today. I became a little bit, I mean, you know, very minorly, but somewhat obsessed a little bit with this Taylor Swift phenomenon.
Really?
You know, why is it happening, right? So now there's Swiftonomics being taught, yeah, at the business schools. I have friends that, you know, they play with me. They call me up and say, you know, I'm sending you the latest on Taylor Swift, the latest class at Harvard, the latest class at Duke, you know, et cetera. So I've become, you know, kind of aware of this and what is produced, you know, what does this mean, you know, to us at this point? What is it a symptom of? But at the same time, how does it become such a phenomenon? You know, in consciousness. What is this we apperception that is making all this possible? I don't know the answer yet. You know, I have some people.
music?
No.
No one I know
Yeah.
knows her music.
Yeah.
Like everyone I ask, like, is she good? Is she bad? You're like,
I heard the lyrics. Some of the lyrics are okay. You know, she's okay as a songwriter. But again, that's like scholarship today. everybody writes template scholasticism, which is not learning at all. So who knows? It may be templates. I don't know anything about. I mean, I'm not trying to, but it's a phenomenon that's taken over. In a certain way. You have classes being offered. This is the new cultural studies. It was Madonna studies in the 90s, right? Now it's Swiftonomics. How can we take on the music industry? Sebastian, you're laughing. Do you have any thoughts about this? Any algorithms?
Sure. I heard about people bemoaning Taylor Swift a long time ago.
Right.
And I was just wondering, why was it that people care so much, and they were complaining like she was ruining their life somehow because of what she did and what she said and her music and the influence. And now all these years later, it's even bigger now. I don't get it. I don't get it. That's all I have to say.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I mean, to me, again, this is something that we may be able to encounter some of these phenomena in our everyday life in the cultural field, if you will, the production field of culture, if you will, when we get to the sections on serial thinking, later in the yeah. He's very good at this. He's very good. Phenomenologically, he's one of the very best, right? In many ways. And and I want to say too, I didn't mention this earlier. I know the Frankfurt School came up. Marcuse argued against existentialism, right? 1948, 49, he wrote pieces against Sartre, in terms of its reliance upon subjectivity, didn't take into account enough of the material conditions. Marcuse used to introduce the philosophy classes, but of course we presuppose political economy. He would always say that to make sure, that he was still identified as Marxist. But anyway, also, Adorno has a bit of a critique in the negative dialectics as well. But Marcuse later, when he was in San Diego, said he was amazed at every word of the critique. He was amazed, just couldn't believe how good it was. Yeah, so I'll try to get you the interview. It was with the philosopher Frederick Olafson, right, at that time. Yeah.
Could I ask you another?
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah.
to give
No
away
problem.
the plot.
I'm glad we're in the text. Yeah.
Not to give, well, this is not about the text, but it's
Yeah.
not to give, but why do you see this project as a failure?
I don't see, I'm just saying what people have said.
Oh,
No, but I mean, it probably is because we haven't realized it. We don't think this way anymore.
mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
we're not thinking, I mean, we're still at the point of sectarianism, right? Still,
Mhm.
you have the DSA on one hand, you have the ISO on the other hand, in the States, that is. You have all these splinter groups among the communists, the communist parties in Europe.
Or no
completely in
politics at
defeat.
all.
And, my thesis now, after we did this work with Arto, going forward, the United States has no political community. There's no possibility of a political community. Yeah. This is really going on. And all you have to do is turn on the TV. Sleepy couldn't even get out the right words when he announced the new thing. He couldn't even remember the word Hamas. This is the president of the United States. I mean, he must be having traumatizing dreams about, Hamas. I mean, it's unbelievable what's going on. Nikki Haley doesn't even know an elementary level, sixth grade interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. And she's possibly going to be one heartbeat away from the presidency of the United States if Trump decides to put her on the ticket. They're big friends now again. And he also said DeSantis, he calls him Ron again instead of sanctimonious. So, we're getting, this is the level that we're at. What political community? Who is talking about material conditions? There are 12 million people in the United States right now, families, who pay 60% of their income to rent, to housing costs. 60% goes out to housing, right? And in New York City, I'm sure it's much higher in terms of the rent that people are making in terms of their reality. And none of this is talked about. Credit card interest rates, 35% in some cases. You can get better deals from the mob. I mean, yeah, I mean, I can go see the Marcellos in New Orleans and get half the rate, right? Anyway, I don't know, what can you say? Yeah, I mean, really, it's just unbelievable and how all this is washed over, covered up, in so many ways. Yeah. And,
To go back
and
to the
so
project-
denial, yeah.
To go back to the project for a
Yeah,
moment, you're talking about the political project just generally or the left?
I think politics itself, it's impossible to form community, in this sense, that we have been reduced to this, that economism has dominated this so much that in some ways Mills's own old division of the power elite, where you have the military, the executive branch, and the political directorate. The political directorate is completely under the military, and the executive right now. This is what's happened. All these guys are just, basically puppets or pawns on the stage for, the military, apparatus, if you will. Yeah, this is going on day in, day out. I mean, how many times maybe in 1970 or late 60s would Lloyd Raytheon Austin be called out since he's a board member of Raytheon, right? That this would not be allowed for a Secretary of Defense. Now it's just matter of fact, right? Right? Matter of fact. The Speaker of the House from Louisiana, this guy from Shreveport. I mean, he really believes we're approaching Armageddon, and it's time to accelerate this by giving Israel more and more money, etc. Because the rapture will happen. They actually believe this stuff.
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying I know this, for a reason. Yeah.
Well, we have to hope about the left that something can look different.
Well, first of all, we should become better leftists first and build it. Yes. No, of course, I'm not really trying to be defeatist here. I mean, the issue again is a movement that is only protest and resistance without theory is bound to fail. And just like if you don't have any practice with the theory and you still work in those economies, that's bound to fail too. You just can't be theoretist, sitting in the academy, because then you become the disinterested subject, like Kant did many, years ago. Kant talked about the disinterested knowledge. He would sit, afar so he could see. In a sense, you don't go down. Just like the debate in the Republic, in the seventh book of the Republic, you go back down into the cave. Yeah, you go back down into the cave. You descend once again. Gramsci, the revolution from below. Where are the organic intellectuals? We have some, yes, it's true, yeah, but in a sense, it becomes sectarian in a way, right? This is part of the problem. And, I remember, to go back a minute to the Left Forum, when Aronowitz was interviewed, and this is on YouTube. It's very interesting, when he gave the talk, he and Cornell and what's his name, Immortal Technique, the Felipe, the rapper, who were all on stage at one of the plenaries talking about revolution, right? And Stanley said, look, in 1861, Bakunin, Proudhon, and Marx came together, even though they all couldn't stand each other. Their positions were very different, but they came together as a unified field, right? And they formed something called the First International, right? So you have the anarchists, right? The social democrats and the communists all coming together at that moment. And we don't have anything close to that.
Exactly.
And
Nothing
then
close.
Marx in his private notebooks would then trash.
Of course,
Calling him
of course.
idiot.
The poverty of philosophy.
Well, even in his private notebooks.
Yes, of course.
That he never.
Yeah,
It's very funny.
No, I mean, in a way.
Yeah.
And going back to Sartre, I mean, you have to admire. Listen, this is someone that never became complacent. I mean, I know I'm being very anecdotal here, but this is someone who could have just lived it out and wrote a few more plays and a few more novels. This is someone who got down and dirty all the way. He did not retreat. his whole life, you know. And, you know, the Black Panthers would go to see him. Richard Wright went to work with him. Chester Himes, all these people were in Paris during this time. These were people that were, again, were in the world. They were not people that were isolated in the academy. This was not, and with all due respect, I mean, Althusser is a great dialectical mind, but he walked every day to work 3 blocks and then back home, right? And would call the party
Explains a
members,
lot.
etc. Yeah. I mean, you know, there's a very different approach to things in terms of the engagé. And I guess you know the story. I forgot the name. I have to look it up. It always escapes me. You know the story of Sartre, that there used to be a young kid that would stand outside the cafe at Dumago and keep peeking in the window when he was writing. He and Simone de Beauvoir were sitting there writing, taking their coffee, and they finally invited him in. He was illiterate. Within a year, completely literate, Sartre worked with him, completely literate, wrote 2 books, and became very famous in Paris as a performer, right? And he says, I'm thinking about death. And he says, what's the name of your book? Oh, The Mexican Disease, Death. Right. Yeah, a lot of funny stories. Mouhiji, I think was his name. But anyway, he took a basically an illiterate, you know, in the thing. All this work on autism, literacy campaigns and all of this. Sartre works with him through, you know, consciousness theory, his own theories, and he basically turns this person's life around completely, right? Right? And how many people get letters, professors that say, I'm having a hard time getting my dissertation defense going. Can you come help me out? Would get on a plane and go to defend someone. Not many. They just say, well, I wish you good luck. Thank you for writing my work. But, you know, what does he do? He goes down and he tells off the committee. You know,
Or tell them that their
yeah.
honorarium is
Anyway,
$10,000.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, I think there's a lot to be an adulation of here, you know, as a figure, you know, and why he was so hated by his own, you know, and he despised the class he came from. He despised it. This is a war machine at work. It's a machine of annihilation. I want you to realize that this is Hegelian annihilation at work. I mean, if you're going to read him at this level, this is very violent, you know, in a sense, Hegelian violence. Heideggerian violence is another kind of violence, you know, in a sense, the etymological, the rerouting, the soil, you know, yeah, it would be good if he had put in Heidegger in the soil there too, in Poland, but anyway, yeah, so very, very violent. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, you know, again, what would Sartre say today? You know, look, in 75, he's blind, right? He has people reading to him. He had not read Gramsci. He had Gramsci read to him. He's really taken by the prison notebooks, especially the sections on the modern prince, on state and hegemony, and then also the sections on historical materialism, right? He had no engagement with the Frankfurt School, so to speak, except Marcuse. You know, Fromm knew him. I thought Fromm took up a Sartrean position. I would always recommend the book Escape from Freedom. I find Sartre more layered, but Escape from Freedom is a very important book. You know, and I think I told you the joke used to be in psychoanalytics, Escape from Frida, you know, this wife psychoanalyst Frida from Franklin, you know, anyway, but yeah, so I mean, this was, you know, in a sense. But again, to me, what I think has to be realized here is that he is in some ways calling out, if you will. He's looking at, you know, this kind of communist comfortability. We have the critique, we're going to win, history will absolve us, history is on our side. You know, a kind of automatic Marxism, in a sense, by calling them out and saying there's no anguish, there's no responsibility ultimately here in some ways, you know, in a way. This is what he's really trying to do. And you have forgotten, in a sense, what it means to exist every day. You know, and what does this mean? Existence precedes essence. Because you're essentializing by calling this just the proletariat. You're essentializing by only saying this, you know, about, you know, and you begin to see, some of you may know Shulamith Firestone's book, The Dialectic of Sex. You can begin to see the influence this kind of stuff was on Shulamith Firestone, where woman becomes a class. You know, it's no longer just a gender distinction, you know, with all due respect to Judy Butler. I mean, up to Judith. Yeah, right. I'm sorry, I'm being nasty there, but anyway, yeah. So, you know, this notion again of freedom and responsibility, how difficult it is, you know, and you know, how difficult choice and the anguish of choice really is, you know, in a sense, that he's really trying to go there. And he makes a comment that that Lukács has the wherewithal to read Heidegger, but won't. And this resonates today. Yeah. He has the wherewithal to do it, but he will not do it.
That's true.
It's very interesting. Yeah. It returns today. Yeah. In many ways, right? In a sense. So, you know, and I think Carl's absolutely right. The Soviet democracy, you know, the Soviet direct democracy, workers' committees, you know, he's going into council communists, which I have a special affection for, you know, the council communists were the freest.
But again, like what he says is
Yeah.
so great because he talks about how both are made into these fetishes,
What page you
right?
on?
So, page 24.
Yeah.
We thus find ourselves in the presence of a typical contradiction between two Platonic ideas. On the one side, the wavering policy of the USSR gave way to a rigorous and predictable action of that entity, quote, the Soviet bureaucracy. On the other side, the workers' committees disappeared before that other entity, the direct democracy. I shall call these two objects general particularities. They are made to pass for particular historical realities when we ought not to see in them anything more than the purely formal unity of abstract universal relations. The process of making them into fetishes will be complete when each one is endowed with real powers. The democracy of workers' committees holds within it the absolute negation of bureaucracy, which reacts by crushing its adversary. I mean, the way I read that is that he's saying that neither side is really thinking. They're both
not Hegelian at all.
Right.
They're not Marxist, really,
Right,
ultimately.
that they're not actually trying to
Right.
learn about the real situation.
Exactly.
You know, and I think that that's still.
And again, the particular and the universal in that movement that is happening here, which is a Hegelian movement. This is really the whole thing about how do we get to the totality and where is what is within itself the absolute negation of the other. Again, the violence of the annihilation of the other moment, which was the bureaucracy, annihilate the bureaucracy through the workers' councils or the workers' committees.
And what
Right.
years?
Oh, he's talking about, he's probably talking about the thirties to
But what he's
through the
what-
40s up until 50.
But what he says is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
whereas he's actually talking about, where does he say it, that the workers, the
But you understand what's going on here, right? That he has this dialectical process in mind in terms of the particular and the universal and how this becomes a fetish, right? Instead of the contained within the workers' democratic committees, right, is the absolute negation, if you will, of the bureaucracies, right? In a sense, he's really looking at this from a Hegelian point of view, and this is the way totalities move. Right, in a sense, and we forget this because we begin to categorize. We have these kind of classification systems that we use instead of seeing this as dialectical. What's contained within that can become the absolute negation of something else, right? So we always do this. We you know, and this is part of the Americanization and the pragmatization of the world in some ways. So that this thinking is that way. You classify. You do it, you know, it's like, you know, you're taking insects, you don't see one that's killing the other, right? Or, instead you're just classifying them into species, So this is a very interesting philosophical exercise that he's doing that is extremely Hegelian. I mean, to me, he is one of the reasons I think that the postmodernists couldn't stand him. You know, and they really went after him. Lyotard used to say, he's so confident, we couldn't stand it. You know, he was so confident. But anyway, one of the reasons they went after him is because he was this, he could think the totality. This was a category that the postmodernists went against, right? That, they always wanted a particular left, this is, et cetera.
But
And
can you
he-
say
he-
more about the history of?
Yeah,
Could I just read?
sure.
To go back to 23.
yeah.
I mean, what, I should have not jumped way ahead, but he says amongst the interpretations which I've just mentioned,
Right.
he's talking about these two positions
Right.
around the Hungarian situation. There is one which allows the method in all its nakedness, that which reduces the facts of Hungary to quote a Soviet act of aggression against the democracy of workers' committees.
Right.
It is obvious that the workers' committees are a democratic institution. One can even maintain that they bear within them the future of the socialist society, but this does not alter the fact that they did not exist in Hungary at the time of the first Soviet intervention, and their appearance during the insurrection was much too brief and too troubled for us to be able to speak of an organized democracy. No matter. And then he goes on to talk about how people attribute things, right? And then get into this position that, you know, the facts, the actual real totality was, and just to say, you know, what I guess I just, you know, today I was thinking about the left. I mean, we don't have Stalinists and Trotskyists duking it out, but I think that there's like a lot of rigidity in the thinking, though. There's still kind of this reductionism, like, you know, this term intersectionality. I really don't like. And
Yes,
I think it's like the total antithesis of dialectical thinking, because you've just got these like
Good.
praxis that are just sort of taken for granted, and they're kind of independent, but then they just intersect at this point, and you know, the game is, where do I fit, you know? And if you think about them for any length of time, the simplicity and apparent elegance just collapses, right?
Right.
But we have like these, so much, you know, we just say white supremacy, or we, you know, this kind of privilege, or, you know, these types of things. It's not to deny the reality of racism, but we're thinking about it without really thinking about it. I mean, that's how I feel about a lot of the political culture of the left is, yes, we're anti-racist, but what does it mean to be an anti-racist today? And, you know, really, like, what does that mean, as opposed to just these kinds of a priori positions that everyone just thinks you said something, and half the time, I don't know what people are talking
Well,
about.
Identity
You know,
politics.
like,
Identity politics, pluralities, he speaks to this.
right.
He speaks to this
Right.
dialectically. This is another. Bill, you wanted to say something about intersectionality, or?
Can I
No,
say
just that
something?
I don't
Oh,
care for
right.
it either.
Okay, okay. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, no, I think it's a very good point in a way too. And I mean, this is always the looking for what I would consider, again, non-dialectical methodology, because dialectics is difficult,
Mhm.
right? Especially Hegelian dialectics, you know, where you're always looking at what's carried inside is actually a negation of something, right?
Mhm.
The negation, and then the negation of the other, and how this spiraling unfolding is going on, right?
Mhm.
How this movement is coming to pass in terms of a circularity, and how it opens into the next stage, if you want to look at it that way, or into the next spiral. It's probably even better, you know, in terms of the development of the mind. And yeah, I mean,
Can I say something about intersectionality?
yeah, of course, yeah, yeah.
I think it should be, people should be instead saying solidarity instead of intersectionality, right? Because to me it sounds like intersectionality is more of a descriptive thing, and you know, if you're gonna do political movement, you should do the normative thing, right?
Right.
Solidarity. That's my take. That's all I
No,
have to say.
very good. And, you know, we'll get to that in the critique, because he does speak to this in the notion of the pledge, and of course, the third term of the French Revolution battle cry, you know, fraternity, right? And actually, you know, I didn't mention today Fanon, you know, in a deeper way, but of course, Fanon, you know, his opening to the wretched of the earth, you know, what does this mean, brotherhood? What does this mean, fraternity, right? Etc. Yeah, so I think you're really on to something, that because the term solidarity has lost its meaning. It's just a slogan, in solidarity, unions, but there's no solidarity. Beryl, please, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, because the intersectionality trend
Right.
is inextricably tied up with identity politics.
Yeah.
You know, well, we've covered race, we've covered gender, we've covered class, you know, except we haven't. And so we can all proceed, but the idea that there should be a sort of general movement
Yes.
would kind of maybe tread on people's identities. You know, each of these categories has their own goal and their own politics. And that's highly problematic, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And the formation of solidarity, how difficult it is, again, which requires freedom and responsibility, and how to do that, you know, in a certain way. Where's that solidarity come from? And you see this much more in other countries, so especially the North American countries don't really have that notion. It's really, you know, he wrote a great piece, by the way. If you really want to understand United States individualism, read Sartre called Individualism and Conformity in the United States. It's an essay he wrote when he came to the United States, I think 46 after the war. And, you know, you were not an individual until you joined the group.
Yes.
No, we respect individualism, says the lady to Sartre. When they come in, they're a member of the group. So individualism in the United States implies conformism. Hence the words bad apple, outsider, you know, et cetera, marginal, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Very important to see this in a sense. You're not really granted the individuality unless you're a member of the group. You conform to it, right, in many ways. And you know, the right is much better at this than the left has been over the last 40-something years. You think about how they built these groups. I mean, the local politics, the national politics, the school boards, the courts. You know, think about how this has been built, how they've gotten to this point. I mean, we're in a totally insane place. I mean, the asylum's out there, you know, not inside the. I mean, you can go to I can go tonight to Bellevue and meet much more saner people than I'm going to meet on the way home, going back to Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Right? You know, yeah.
Well, you know, the thing to me, what I thought when you mentioned the right is that they don't have the same pretense that what they're doing is inherently democratic or quote prefigurative. They want power and they organize themselves accordingly.
Right.
The left, I think, has become extremely authoritarian, particularly under Trump, in terms of the absolute intolerance of disagreement about
Well, it's an authoritarian horizontalism.
I mean,
in a
some,
way.
I'm
Yeah,
saying
this
some
is a
people on
problem.
the
Yes,
left.
I agree.
I've
Yeah,
encountered this
yeah,
just in my personal,
yeah,
my
yeah.
interpersonal relations with some of the people closest to me in my life.
Right.
You sort of say something that doesn't agree with what they think is like what you should be saying about Trump, and you know, we get into these huge arguments, and I'm thinking, why are we? But it's what I experience is just intolerance and no curiosity. And again, like looking at the riot at the Capitol riot and saying, what's happening here? This is interesting. What's going on? And so
I always say, how come you weren't there representing the left?
right, that's what I was.
That's what I
doing.
say.
When I was watching it,
How come you weren't there to take over the White House, the Congress of the United States? Why weren't you there to take on the legislature?
Exactly. I was looking at it.
Where was you?
Why are we doing this? We
Exactly.
should be like, why are we
Exactly.
condemning people for
Right.
sedition?
Right, right.
When we should be the seditionists. I
Right.
mean, it's just, yeah, I mean, but the intolerance you find today, sometimes in terms of any deviation from what's considered the politically okay position around so many things
Right.
is, yeah, it's
And
very.
simultaneously, they leave out strategy, so
Yes.
they're.
But then we're all
independent.
committed to democracy and we're all horizontal
right.
and, you know,
Right,
there's
right.
this myth
Yeah.
that we're doing a certain kind of politics when the right, I don't think, has that same myth about, they have other myths, but they don't have that myth.
Taylor agrees. Yeah.
They're not prefiguring a non-oppressive world.
Right.
That's not what they're
Right.
trying to do. No, they don't
Right.
talk about themselves in that way, right? So the left does, or at least certain sectors of the left that I've been.
Well, again, I mean, I really see Sartre in some ways opening up. I mean, maybe why Marcuse was so impressed. And I mean, you know, this is my, I guess, second time around with this book and this thinking of his later period. Maybe why there was such an impressive reception of this is that the third way is really being proposed here in some ways by going through the old idealism, materialism debates in a way and trying to side. So this is one of the reasons he's good, so grounded in the historical. This is a historical, work as well as philosophical. It's very, very important, in this historical genetic method. So, we can talk, I know we're getting close to, where we're going to be kicked out. We're under orders to be out of here this time. But, we have 5 more minutes, but I was going to say, maybe next week, I think the best thing to do is maybe go over the progressive regressive method a little more, see it at work, and read the section on mediations and actually the last chapter too. Get through the method next week, and then we can go into the major text on the 3rd week, into the critique itself. Because I think we'll get somewhere. I mean, what I would like us to do is to think through this dialectical reasoning, how he's doing it in terms of the method, right, first and foremost, and then how it plays out in the main text itself. Those of you that have gotten the text, I mean, the Jameson introduction is pretty good. To me, it's typical Jameson, but very good, in a way. The earlier book is the same text, same translator, and I'm going to want to go through this, first through the dogmatic and the critical dialectic, and then how you critique, if you will, critical investigation. And I'm very interested because it's coming back up again under the category of Western Marxism, the problem of Stalinism, the individual, and then he goes through the plan of the work in the critiques. So I'll anticipate this, maybe how to read it the best we can. And I want to concentrate very much on praxis as totalization. What does it mean to be in activity? What does it mean to be active? What does it mean to always be working with higher conceptions? And especially the section on need, the negation of the negation and labor. I think that's very, very important. So I'll go over this next week. There's very good stuff on the institution too. I mean, this, the more I think about this, look, it's very dense. It's verbose at times. Like I said, he's taking massive amounts of speed. Paul Ricoeur, who's a first-rate philosopher, said he didn't read it because he knew to read it phenomenologically, he'd have to take the same quantity of Sartre to do it justice, and he didn't want to do that, so he forego reading it. Anyway, like I said, I've got good espresso. I'll try my best. Maybe everybody should bring their highest power espresso or whatever. I mean,
We'll bring some
yeah,
coke.
we'll bring some coke.
The coke and are all screwed.
Yeah. The thing about it, it's amazing he lived to 75 years old because the abuse that he did to his body is amazing. This was not someone who was a major walker or whatever. This is someone sitting over a desk, a writing machine and supposedly this was written without any editing. This is another thing too, to give you an idea. So what you're in for, there was no editing going on. It's just the writing machine at work in many ways. So, kind of interesting in that regard. So we will talk more about that. So yeah, especially this notion. I mean, I hope tonight that at least we start understanding particularity, the universal, how this works in the Hegelian thing, how he's employing it going forward, and what his intentions are to bring everyday life and experience back into the Marxist tradition. This notion of experience in terms of lived experience, not just experience, but lived experience. This is something that he uses. Vécu is the French word that he uses, as lived experience. It's a term that he uses often, that he takes from phenomenology, but he puts his own stamp on it. So, yeah. So anyway, so it's nice to see everybody. I hope we have fun with this. As Sartre once said, always accompanied by laughter at the end. That's the way to break up fascism. So I'll send you the latest from Highway 61. The Taylor Swifty moment at the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I want to learn more about Taylor
Right.
Swift.
Okay. Good. All right. Everybody be well. And good to see some of you. It's been a while. Bye bye. Take care. Thank you. Okay.